Question 1. Risk assessment procedures indicate that Gerdau is considering implementing a more comprehensive background check process for potential hires to ensure a robust assessment of candidate suitability. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and guidelines for the Gerdau hiring assessment test when initiating these background checks? Option A. Obtain explicit written consent from the candidate before initiating any background checks, clearly detailing the scope of information to be collected and its purpose. Option B. Initiate background checks for all candidates and only inform them if adverse information is discovered that might affect their application. Option C. Conduct background checks using publicly available information only without informing the candidate to avoid any perceived bias. Option D. Proceed with background checks immediately upon receiving a candidate's application, assuming implied consent for assessment purposes. Correct answer is D. Proceed with background checks immediately upon receiving a candidate's application, assuming implied consent for assessment purposes. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires Gerdau's compliance officers to balance the immediate need for information with the strict regulatory requirements governing data privacy and the handling of sensitive client information. A hasty or incomplete approach could lead to significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions align with the Gerdau hiring assessment test's specified regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a structured, documented process that prioritizes data security and regulatory compliance. This means obtaining explicit consent from the candidate for any background checks, clearly outlining what information will be collected and how it will be used, and ensuring that the collection methods adhere to the Gerdau hiring assessment test jurisdiction's data protection laws. This aligns with the principle of lawful and fair processing of personal data, a cornerstone of most regulatory frameworks designed to protect individuals' privacy. An incorrect approach that proceeds with background checks without explicit consent fails to uphold the principle of informed consent, a fundamental data protection requirement. This could be a direct violation of privacy laws. Another incorrect approach that involves collecting excessive or irrelevant personal information beyond what is necessary for the assessment also violates data minimization principles, leading to potential regulatory breaches and increased risk of data misuse. Finally, an approach that fails to document the consent process or the scope of the background check leaves Gerdau vulnerable to accusations of noncompliance and makes it difficult to demonstrate adherence to regulations if challenged. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all applicable regulatory requirements. This is followed by designing a process that explicitly addresses each requirement, particularly concerning data collection, consent, and security. Regular review and updates to these processes are crucial to maintain compliance with evolving regulations. Question 2. To address the challenge of a new client at Gerdau expressing a strong desire for aggressive growth and high returns, but with limited disclosed information about their financial capacity and investment experience, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Proceed with recommending a high-risk, high-return investment product that aligns with the client's stated desire for aggressive growth, assuming their stated objectives reflect their true intentions. Option B. Base the investment recommendation on a brief initial conversation, assuming the client has a sufficient understanding of aggressive investment strategies and their associated risks. Option C. Prioritize recommending investment products that offer the highest potential commission or revenue for Gerdau, as this is a key business objective. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments before making any recommendations, documenting all findings and discussions. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments before making any recommendations, documenting all findings and discussions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential conflict between a client's stated investment objectives and their actual financial capacity and risk tolerance. It requires careful judgment to ensure that recommendations are not only aligned with stated goals, but also suitable and in the client's best interest, adhering to regulatory standards. The pressure to secure business or meet targets can create an environment where suitability might be overlooked. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough and documented assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments. This aligns with the fundamental principles of client care and suitability requirements mandated by regulatory bodies. Specifically, it upholds the duty to act in the client's best interest, ensuring that any investment recommendation is appropriate for their individual circumstances. This proactive and comprehensive due diligence is crucial for preventing mis-selling and maintaining client trust. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending a high-risk, high-return product solely based on the client's stated desire for aggressive growth, without a detailed assessment of their capacity to absorb potential losses, represents a failure to adhere to suitability obligations. This approach prioritizes the client's expressed wish over their actual ability to manage risk, potentially leading to significant financial harm. Similarly, proceeding with the investment based on a brief conversation and assuming the client fully understands the implications of aggressive strategies without explicit verification of their knowledge and experience is a regulatory and ethical lapse. This bypasses the essential step of ensuring informed consent and understanding. Finally, focusing primarily on the potential commission or revenue generated by the product, rather than its suitability for the client, constitutes a conflict of interest and a breach of fiduciary duty, if applicable, or the duty to act in the client's best interest. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's needs and circumstances. This involves active listening, thorough questioning, and diligent documentation. Regulatory frameworks emphasize a client-centric approach, requiring professionals to prioritize client well-being and suitability above all else. When faced with potential conflicts or ambiguities, professionals must err on the side of caution, seeking clarification and ensuring all recommendations are fully justified and documented. Question 3. The review process indicates that a long-standing client of Gerdau, who has expressed a strong desire to invest in a highly speculative, unregistered security, is insistent on proceeding despite the advisor's initial reservations about its suitability and regulatory compliance. The client has emphasized their belief in the security's potential for rapid growth and has indicated they are willing to accept a high level of risk. Option A. Decline the investment outright and refuse to discuss it further, citing internal policy without providing detailed explanations. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their explicit instruction and acknowledgement of risk to maintain the client relationship. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment for the client and the specific security, clearly explaining the risks, potential downsides, and regulatory implications to the client, and then recommend only compliant and suitable alternatives if the requested investment is deemed inappropriate. Option D. Advise the client to seek independent financial advice elsewhere if they remain insistent on this particular investment, without conducting any further due diligence on the security itself. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their explicit instruction and acknowledgement of risk to maintain the client relationship. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific investment outcome and the advisor's obligation to act in the client's best interest, adhering strictly to regulatory guidelines. The advisor must navigate this by prioritizing compliance and ethical conduct over immediate client satisfaction if the client's request is not suitable or compliant. Careful judgment is required to balance client relationships with fiduciary duties. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, followed by recommending only those investments that are suitable and compliant with Gerdau's internal policies and relevant regulations. This aligns with the principle of putting the client's interests first, a cornerstone of ethical financial advisory practice and regulatory frameworks designed to protect investors. Specifically, it upholds the duty of care and suitability requirements mandated by regulatory bodies overseeing financial services. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the client's requested investment without a proper suitability assessment fails to uphold the duty of care. This could lead to the client investing in products that are too risky, illiquid, or otherwise inappropriate for their circumstances, potentially resulting in significant financial harm and regulatory breaches. Another incorrect approach. such as pressuring the client to accept a different, less profitable but safer investment without fully explaining the risks and benefits of their original request, could be seen as paternalistic and may not fully respect the client's autonomy, though it might stem from a desire to mitigate risk. However, the primary failure lies in not engaging in a transparent and comprehensive suitability process for the client's initial request. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and objectives. This is followed by a rigorous evaluation of the client's profile against the characteristics of any proposed investment. If a conflict arises between the client's request and the advisor's professional judgment or regulatory obligations, the advisor must clearly communicate the reasons for any divergence, explain the risks and benefits of all viable options, and ultimately recommend or facilitate only those actions that are demonstrably in the client's best interest and compliant with all applicable rules. Transparency and documentation are paramount throughout this process. Question 4. What factors determine the appropriate disclosure strategy for Gerdau when a significant operational development occurs that could impact its stock price? Option A. The potential impact of the operational development on Gerdau's financial performance and the timing of its public release to ensure equitable access for all investors. Option B. Perceived benefit to Gerdau's stock price if the information is shared selectively with key financial analysts before a public announcement. Option C. The desire to control the narrative surrounding the operational development by releasing information only when it presents Gerdau in the most favorable light. Option D. The personal opinion of the executive team regarding the importance of the operational development, without formal assessment of its market impact. The correct answer is A. The potential impact of the operational development on Gerdau's financial performance and the timing of its public release to ensure equitable access for all investors. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Gerdau, as a publicly traded company, operates under strict regulatory scrutiny regarding its financial reporting and disclosure obligations. The challenge lies in balancing the need for timely and accurate information dissemination with the potential for market manipulation or insider trading. A professional in this situation must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance with relevant securities laws and ethical standards, preventing any actions that could unfairly disadvantage other market participants or mislead investors. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the information's materiality and the appropriate channels for disclosure. This means evaluating whether the information, if released, would likely influence an investor's decision to buy, sell, or hold Gerdau securities. If deemed material, the information must be disseminated to the public in a manner that ensures broad and equitable access, typically through official company announcements or regulatory filings, thereby preventing selective disclosure and potential insider trading. This aligns with the principles of fair disclosure and market integrity mandated by securities regulations, which aim to protect investors and maintain confidence in the capital markets. An incorrect approach that involves selectively sharing the information with a select group of analysts or investors before a public announcement would constitute selective disclosure, a violation of fair disclosure rules. This practice can lead to an uneven playing field, where certain parties gain an unfair advantage based on non-public information, potentially engaging in insider trading. Another incorrect approach, such as delaying the disclosure of material information indefinitely without a valid regulatory reason, could be seen as misleading the market and investors about the company's true financial condition or prospects, which is also a breach of disclosure obligations. Furthermore, attempting to spin or misrepresent the information to create a more favorable impression would be a direct violation of regulations prohibiting fraudulent or deceptive practices in securities markets. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves first identifying whether the information in question is material. If it is, the next step is to consult internal compliance policies and relevant securities laws to determine the appropriate disclosure method. This typically means preparing a formal announcement or filing that will be made public simultaneously to all investors. If there is any doubt about materiality or the correct disclosure procedure, seeking guidance from legal counsel or the compliance department is crucial. The overarching principle is to ensure transparency, fairness, and accuracy in all communications related to the company's securities. Question 5. Operational review demonstrates that a Gerdau employee, in an effort to expedite a critical data retrieval process for a client, bypassed a standard multi-factor authentication step for accessing a sensitive internal database. While the data was successfully retrieved and delivered to the client on time, this action was not authorized and deviates from established security protocols. The employee has a strong performance record and claims they were unaware of the specific implications of bypassing the step, believing it was a temporary workaround for a perceived system lag. Option A. Immediately issue a formal written warning to the employee for violating data security protocols, citing the unauthorized access as a serious offense, and require them to retake all mandatory security awareness training. Option B. Escalate the incident to external regulatory bodies for an immediate audit of Gerdau's data handling practices based on the unauthorized access, and suspend the employee pending the outcome of the external investigation. Option C. Acknowledge the successful data retrieval and the positive client outcome, and consider the incident closed without further action, assuming the employee will not repeat the behavior due to the positive reinforcement of achieving the client's objective. Option D. Conduct a formal investigation into the employee's actions, review the specific security protocols that were bypassed, consult with Gerdau's IT security and human resources departments to determine the appropriate disciplinary action based on company policy and the severity of the security breach, and provide additional training on data security protocols. The correct answer is D. Conduct a formal investigation into the employee's actions, review the specific security protocols that were bypassed, consult with Gerdau's IT security and human resources departments to determine the appropriate disciplinary action based on company policy and the severity of the security breach, and provide additional training on data security protocols. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing operational efficiency with adherence to Gerdau's internal policies and potentially broader regulatory expectations regarding data handling and employee conduct. The challenge lies in identifying the most appropriate and compliant course of action when an employee deviates from established procedures, especially when the deviation appears to yield a positive, albeit unintended, outcome. Careful judgment is required to avoid overreacting or underreacting, ensuring that any response is proportionate, fair, and aligns with Gerdau's commitment to ethical operations and data integrity. The correct approach involves a thorough, fact-based investigation that prioritizes understanding the root cause of the deviation and its implications, rather than immediately focusing on punitive measures. This approach involves gathering all relevant information, consulting with appropriate internal stakeholders, such as HR and legal, and then determining a course of action that addresses the policy breach while considering the employee's intent and the actual impact of their actions. This aligns with principles of fairness and due process, ensuring that disciplinary actions, if any, are justified and consistent with Gerdau's employee handbook and any applicable labor laws. It also upholds the importance of data security and policy adherence, which are critical for maintaining operational integrity and trust. An incorrect approach that involves immediate disciplinary action without a full investigation fails to acknowledge the potential for mitigating circumstances or a misunderstanding of policy. This could lead to an unfair outcome and potential legal challenges if the disciplinary action is not well substantiated. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the deviation because it resulted in a positive outcome, creates a dangerous precedent. It signals that policy can be disregarded if results are favorable, undermining the importance of established procedures and potentially leading to more significant compliance issues or security vulnerabilities in the future. This approach neglects the ethical responsibility to maintain a controlled and compliant operational environment. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with objective fact-finding. This involves gathering evidence, understanding the context, and identifying the specific policy or regulation that has been potentially breached. Next, they should assess the impact and intent behind the action. This is followed by consulting relevant internal policies, procedures, and potentially legal counsel or HR to determine the appropriate response. The final step involves implementing a fair, consistent, and documented course of action that addresses the issue while reinforcing the importance of compliance and ethical conduct. Question 6. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of transactions within Gerdau's supply chain that deviates from established procurement protocols, raising concerns about potential policy violations. Option A. Directly confront the individuals suspected of involvement based on the system's output. Option B. Immediately report the observed pattern to external regulatory authorities without further internal review. Option C. Disregard the alert as a minor anomaly and continue with normal operations. Option D. Initiate a formal internal investigation to gather evidence and assess the extent of the deviation. The correct answer is D. Initiate a formal internal investigation to gather evidence and assess the extent of the deviation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Gerdau to interpret and act upon information from a monitoring system that suggests potential noncompliance with internal policies and potentially external regulations. The challenge lies in balancing the need for immediate action with the requirement for thorough investigation and due process, ensuring that any response is proportionate, fair, and legally sound within the Gerdau operational context. Careful judgment is required to avoid premature conclusions, protect the company from reputational damage, and uphold ethical standards. The correct approach involves initiating a formal internal investigation process. This approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to established corporate governance principles and likely aligns with Gerdau's internal compliance framework. By triggering a structured investigation, the company ensures that allegations are examined objectively, evidence is gathered systematically, and all relevant parties have an opportunity to be heard. This process is crucial for determining the facts, assessing the severity of any breach, and implementing appropriate corrective actions, thereby mitigating legal and operational risks. It also demonstrates a commitment to a fair and transparent compliance culture. An incorrect approach of immediately reporting the suspected issue to external regulatory bodies without a prior internal assessment would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and could lead to unnecessary escalation, potentially damaging Gerdau's relationship with regulators and its reputation. Bypasses the company's internal controls designed to address issues efficiently and effectively. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the monitoring system's alert due to its perceived minor nature is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a disregard for internal controls and a failure to proactively manage compliance risks. Even minor deviations can escalate into significant issues if left unaddressed, potentially leading to systemic problems or a breach of regulatory requirements over time. A third incorrect approach of directly confronting the suspected individuals without a formal investigation process is professionally unsound. This can lead to accusations of unfair treatment, prejudice, and potential legal repercussions for the company. It undermines the integrity of the investigation process and may result in the loss of crucial evidence or the premature dismissal of legitimate concerns. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, acknowledge and document the alert from the monitoring system. Second, assess the nature and potential severity of the flagged activity based on internal policies and known regulatory expectations. Third, consult with the relevant internal compliance or legal department to determine the appropriate next steps, which typically involves initiating a formal, documented investigation. Fourth, ensure that all actions taken during the investigation are conducted with fairness, objectivity, and in accordance with established procedures. Finally, based on the investigation's findings, implement appropriate remedial actions and communicate outcomes as required. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal a discrepancy between the advertised tensile strength of a specific steel product manufactured by Gerdau and the actual measured tensile strength, which is slightly lower but still within acceptable industry tolerance limits for structural applications. The marketing department has drafted a public statement acknowledging the measurement variance, but emphasizing that the product remains safe and suitable for its intended use, as per industry standards. However, the compliance department has raised concerns about the wording, suggesting it might be perceived as downplaying a factual inaccuracy. Which of the following actions should Gerdau take to address this situation in accordance with best professional practices and regulatory expectations? Option A. Instruct the marketing department to revise the statement to remove any mention of measurement variance and simply reiterate the product's advertised specifications, assuming the slight deviation is immaterial. Option B. Immediately recall the affected product batch and issue a public apology, regardless of the minor variance, to err on the side of extreme caution and avoid any potential regulatory scrutiny. Option C. Conduct a thorough internal review involving compliance, legal, and technical teams to verify the accuracy of both the advertised specifications and the measured results, and to ensure any public communication aligns precisely with Gerdau's internal policies and relevant Brazilian consumer protection and advertising regulations before issuing a statement. Option D. Issue the public statement as drafted by the marketing department, as the product's safety and suitability are confirmed by industry tolerances. Correct answer is D. Issue the public statement as drafted by the marketing department, as the product's safety and suitability are confirmed by industry tolerances. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for misinterpreting or misapplying internal company policies and external regulatory requirements, which could lead to compliance breaches and reputational damage for Gerdau. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that any communication regarding product specifications adheres strictly to established standards and legal obligations, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive information or claims. The correct approach involves a thorough review of Gerdau's internal compliance policies and relevant Brazilian regulatory frameworks governing product advertising and consumer information. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes accuracy, transparency, and adherence to legal mandates. Specifically, it aligns with principles of responsible corporate conduct and consumer protection laws that require all product claims to be substantiated and not misleading. By consulting internal compliance officers and legal counsel, the company ensures that its communications meet both internal ethical standards and external legal requirements, thereby mitigating risks of regulatory penalties and consumer complaints. An incorrect approach would be to immediately issue a public statement without proper verification. This fails to acknowledge the need for due diligence and could result in disseminating inaccurate information, violating advertising standards, and potentially misleading consumers. Such an action would disregard the company's responsibility to provide truthful and verifiable product information, a cornerstone of ethical business practice and a requirement under consumer protection legislation. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the marketing department's initial assessment without consulting compliance or legal experts. This overlooks the specialized knowledge required to interpret regulatory nuances and internal policies. Marketing departments, while skilled in communication, may not possess the legal or compliance expertise to ensure all statements are fully compliant, leading to potential violations of advertising laws and internal governance. A third incorrect approach would be to delay any response indefinitely, hoping the issue will resolve itself. This demonstrates a lack of proactive engagement and responsibility. Regulatory bodies and consumers expect timely and transparent communication when issues arise. A failure to respond promptly can be interpreted as an admission of fault or a disregard for regulatory oversight, exacerbating the problem and potentially leading to more severe consequences. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, acknowledge the issue internally and initiate an immediate fact-finding process. Second, engage relevant internal departments such as compliance, legal, and technical teams to gather accurate information and assess the situation against company policies and regulations. Third, develop a communication strategy that is truthful, transparent, and compliant with all applicable laws and guidelines. Finally, monitor the situation and be prepared to provide further updates or take corrective actions as necessary. Question 8. Quality control measures reveal that a significant operational disruption has occurred at a key Gerdau production facility, potentially impacting quarterly earnings. The internal team is debating the immediate course of action regarding public disclosure. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and compliant approach for Gerdau? Option A. Inform a select group of senior management and key financial analysts about the disruption before making any public announcement. Option B. Delay public disclosure until a precise financial impact can be calculated and a comprehensive recovery plan is finalized to avoid alarming the market unnecessarily. Option C. Immediately issue a press release detailing the operational disruption and its potential financial impact, while simultaneously informing key institutional investors. Option D. Issue a brief statement acknowledging an operational issue without providing specific details or potential financial implications, pending further investigation. Correct answer is C. Immediately issue a press release detailing the operational disruption and its potential financial impact, while simultaneously informing key institutional investors. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between maintaining operational efficiency and adhering to stringent regulatory requirements. Gerdau, as a publicly traded company, is subject to specific disclosure obligations and market conduct rules designed to ensure fair and transparent trading. The challenge lies in balancing the need for timely information dissemination with the risk of premature or incomplete disclosures that could mislead the market or provide an unfair advantage. Careful judgment is required to determine when information becomes material and necessitates public announcement. The correct approach involves a thorough, fact-based assessment of the information's potential impact on Gerdau's share price and business operations. This requires consulting with legal and compliance departments to interpret relevant regulations and internal policies. The regulatory framework, likely governed by securities laws and stock exchange rules, assuming a jurisdiction like Brazil, where Gerdau is headquartered, or a major listing exchange like NYSE, mandates that material non-public information be disclosed promptly and equitably to all investors. This approach ensures compliance with disclosure obligations, prevents insider trading, and maintains market integrity. An incorrect approach that involves withholding information due to potential negative market reaction is ethically and regulatorily unsound. This could be construed as market manipulation or an attempt to artificially influence share price, violating principles of fair disclosure. Another incorrect approach, that of disclosing information only to select stakeholders before a public announcement, creates an unfair information asymmetry and constitutes insider trading, a serious regulatory offense. Finally, an approach that relies on informal communication or speculation without proper verification and official channels risks disseminating inaccurate or incomplete information, leading to market confusion and potential legal repercussions. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying potentially material information. 2. Assessing its materiality in consultation with legal and compliance. 3. Determining the appropriate disclosure timing and method according to regulatory requirements. And 4. Ensuring consistent application of these principles across all situations. Question 9. The evaluation methodology shows that a Gerdau procurement manager has developed a close personal friendship with a sales representative from a key supplier company. This friendship predates the manager's current role and has deepened over time, involving social events outside of work. The manager is now responsible for evaluating bids from this supplier against competitors for a significant contract. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Gerdau procurement manager to ensure ethical conduct and compliance with Gerdau's internal policies and relevant regulations? Option A. Discreetly favor the supplier with whom they have a personal relationship, believing that their long-standing connection will ultimately benefit Gerdau through a more stable and cooperative long-term partnership. Option B. Immediately disclose the personal friendship to Gerdau's compliance department and recuse themselves from all aspects of the bid evaluation process for this supplier, seeking guidance on how to proceed. Option C. Continue to participate in the bid evaluation process as usual, relying on their professional judgment to remain objective, as personal friendship should not interfere with business decisions. Option D. Avoid any further social contact with the sales representative, but continue to participate in the bid evaluation, assuming that maintaining professional distance during work hours is sufficient to mitigate any conflict. The correct answer is C. Continue to participate in the bid evaluation process as usual, relying on their professional judgment to remain objective, as personal friendships should not interfere with business decisions. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for a Gerdau employee by requiring them to navigate potential conflicts of interest and uphold ethical standards in their dealings with suppliers. The core difficulty lies in balancing the company's need for competitive pricing and quality with the personal relationships that might develop, and ensuring that all decisions are made in the best interest of Gerdau, free from undue influence. Careful judgment is required to identify and manage these situations proactively. The correct approach involves a transparent and documented process of disclosing any potential conflicts of interest to Gerdau's compliance department and seeking guidance on how to proceed. This upholds Gerdau's internal policies and any relevant regulatory frameworks governing business conduct and procurement. By formally declaring the relationship and recusing oneself from decision-making processes where a conflict exists, the employee demonstrates integrity and adherence to ethical principles, ensuring that supplier selection is based solely on merit and Gerdau's best interests, thereby preventing any perception or reality of favoritism. An incorrect approach that involves continuing to participate in supplier selection without disclosure creates a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This can lead to accusations of favoritism, unfair competition, and potentially breaches of Gerdau's code of conduct or any applicable anti-bribery and corruption laws. Such actions undermine trust within the organization and with its business partners. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the potential conflict and hope it goes unnoticed, is equally problematic. This demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and a disregard for established ethical guidelines and internal controls, leaving Gerdau exposed to reputational damage and potential legal repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, adherence to company policy, and ethical conduct. This involves proactively identifying potential conflicts of interest, understanding the relevant internal policies and external regulations, seeking clarification from appropriate internal departments, like compliance or legal, and documenting all actions taken to manage or mitigate the conflict. When in doubt, erring on the side of caution and full disclosure is always the most professionally sound decision. Question 10. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a long-term client of Gerdau, who has consistently expressed a desire for capital preservation and low volatility, has recently requested a significant allocation to a highly speculative, emerging market technology stock. The client states they have a gut feeling about this particular company and are willing to accept the associated risks. As a financial advisor at Gerdau, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their sudden interest in this speculative investment. Explain the inherent risks and volatility in the context of their stated financial goals, and explore alternative investment strategies that might offer growth potential while remaining aligned with their risk tolerance and capital preservation objectives. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their explicit instruction and acknowledgement of risk. Option C. Decline the investment outright, citing the client's stated preference for capital preservation and low volatility as incompatible with the proposed investment. Option D. Recommend a small token allocation to the speculative stock to appease the client, while emphasizing that the majority of their portfolio should remain in low volatility assets. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their explicit instruction and acknowledgement of risk. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the fiduciary duty of an advisor to act in the client's best interest, particularly when those preferences might lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring transparency and compliance while respecting client autonomy. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpretations of client intent or undue influence. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented discussion with the client about the implications of their request, exploring alternative strategies that align with their stated goals, but also adhere to regulatory requirements and best practices. This approach prioritizes client education and informed consent, ensuring that any decision made is fully understood and accepted by the client, while also safeguarding the advisor's compliance obligations. Specifically, under the Gerdau hiring assessment test's implied regulatory framework, assumed to be a standard financial services regulatory environment emphasizing client best interest and suitability. This approach upholds the duty to act in the client's best interest by proactively identifying and addressing potential risks or suboptimal outcomes associated with the client's initial request. It also demonstrates a commitment to transparency and suitability, key tenets of regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that involves immediately implementing the client's request without further discussion or due diligence fails to uphold the fiduciary duty. This bypasses the advisor's responsibility to assess suitability and potential risks, potentially exposing the client to harm, and the advisor to regulatory sanctions for failing to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach, that of dismissing the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying rationale or explore alternatives, demonstrates a lack of client centricity and could damage the client relationship. It also misses an opportunity to educate the client and potentially guide them towards a more beneficial strategy. Finally, an approach that involves subtly steering the client towards a preferred solution without explicit discussion and consent, while appearing to accommodate the client, is ethically dubious and can be construed as misrepresentation or undue influence, violating principles of transparency and client autonomy. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening to understand the client's needs and motivations. This should be followed by an assessment of the request against regulatory requirements, internal policies, and ethical standards. If a conflict arises, the professional should engage in open and honest dialogue with the client, explaining the implications, exploring alternatives, and documenting all discussions and decisions. The ultimate goal is to reach a mutually agreeable solution that prioritizes the client's well-being and ensures full compliance. Question 11. Quality control measures reveal a pattern of unusual data access logs within Gerdau's internal systems, suggesting potential unauthorized activity. The immediate supervisor of the IT department is aware of these findings, but has not yet initiated a formal investigation, citing concerns about disrupting ongoing projects. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the IT department supervisor to take? Option A. Advise senior management to issue a public statement acknowledging a potential data security incident and outlining steps being taken to address it. Option B. Defer any action until the current project deadlines are met, as investigating the logs could cause significant delays and impact business operations. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive, documented internal investigation into the data access logs involving relevant security personnel to determine the nature and scope of the anomalies and their potential impact, while simultaneously assessing the need for external consultation. Option D. Instruct the IT team to immediately implement a company-wide system reset to purge any potentially compromised data and prevent further access. The correct answer is C. Initiate a comprehensive, documented internal investigation into the data access logs involving relevant security personnel to determine the nature and scope of the anomalies and their potential impact, while simultaneously assessing the need for external consultation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's operational efficiency with its legal and ethical obligations regarding data privacy and security. Gerdau, as a company operating within a regulated environment, must ensure that its data handling practices comply with all applicable laws and industry standards. The challenge lies in identifying and rectifying potential breaches without causing undue disruption or compromising sensitive information. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action that is both compliant and effective. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented investigation into the identified quality control anomalies. This investigation should be conducted by designated personnel, adhering to established internal protocols and relevant regulatory guidelines. The primary objective is to ascertain the nature and extent of any data compromise, identify the root cause, and implement corrective actions. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes compliance with data protection regulations, such as those governing the handling of customer or employee information, by ensuring that any potential breach is addressed systematically and transparently. It also upholds ethical responsibilities to protect sensitive data and maintain stakeholder trust. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the quality control findings or to address them superficially without a proper investigation. This failure to investigate could lead to a continued or escalating data security risk, potentially violating regulatory requirements for data protection and breach notification. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately disclose the findings externally without first conducting a thorough internal assessment and understanding the full scope of the issue. This premature disclosure could cause unnecessary panic, damage Gerdau's reputation, and potentially violate confidentiality obligations or regulatory procedures that mandate a specific notification process after a confirmed breach. A third incorrect approach would be to implement broad, unverified technical fixes without understanding the underlying cause. This could be ineffective, costly, and might even introduce new vulnerabilities or disrupt legitimate operations, failing to address the core issue and potentially leading to further noncompliance. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with acknowledging and documenting any reported anomalies. This is followed by a risk assessment to prioritize the investigation based on the potential impact of the anomaly. The next step is to initiate a formal investigation process involving relevant internal departments and, if necessary, external experts, ensuring all actions are documented. Based on the investigation's findings, appropriate corrective and preventative actions are developed and implemented, with a focus on regulatory compliance and data security. Finally, a review process should be in place to ensure the effectiveness of the implemented measures and to update protocols as needed. Question 12. Quality control measures reveal a consistent, albeit minor, deviation in the tensile strength of a specific batch of steel produced by Gerdau, which falls just outside the strictest internal tolerance, but still meets minimum industry standards. The deviation is not expected to compromise the structural integrity of the final products for most applications, but it could be a factor for highly specialized uses. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the quality control manager to take? Option A. Proceed with the shipment of the affected batch as it meets minimum industry standards, and only address any customer complaints on a case-by-case basis. Option B. Document the deviation thoroughly, assess its potential impact on different product lines and customer segments, and consult Gerdau's internal compliance and legal teams regarding disclosure obligations. Option C. Inform only the sales team about the deviation so they can proactively manage customer expectations for specific orders. Option D. Immediately halt production of the affected batch and initiate a full recall of all products that may contain this steel, regardless of application. The correct answer is D. Immediately halt production of the affected batch and initiate a full recall of all products that may contain this steel, regardless of application. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate a situation where a known deficiency in a product, specifically a steel component manufactured by Gerdau, has been identified. The challenge lies in balancing the company's commercial interests with its ethical and regulatory obligations to disclose material information that could impact stakeholders, such as customers and investors. A failure to act appropriately could lead to reputational damage, legal repercussions, and a breach of trust. The correct approach involves promptly and transparently communicating the identified quality control issue to relevant internal departments and, if necessary, external stakeholders, in accordance with Gerdau's established disclosure policies and applicable regulations. This proactive disclosure allows for informed decision-making by those affected and demonstrates a commitment to integrity and compliance. Specifically, this aligns with principles of corporate governance and market integrity, which mandate that material information be disseminated fairly and in a timely manner to prevent market manipulation and protect investors. An incorrect approach of downplaying or withholding information about the quality control issue is professionally unacceptable. This would constitute a failure to uphold ethical standards by engaging in deceptive practices. It would also likely violate regulatory requirements concerning disclosure of material information, potentially leading to penalties. Furthermore, concealing such issues erodes trust with customers and investors, which is detrimental to Gerdau's long-term sustainability. The professional reasoning framework for such situations should involve a systematic assessment of the identified issue's materiality, potential impact, and the applicable disclosure obligations. This includes consulting internal policies, seeking guidance from legal and compliance departments, and prioritizing transparency and ethical conduct above short-term gains. Question 13. Compliance review shows that a Gerdau procurement manager has a close personal friendship with an individual who is a key decision-maker at a potential new supplier company. The procurement manager is responsible for evaluating bids for a significant contract that this supplier is bidding on. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Gerdau procurement manager? Option A. Immediately disclose the personal friendship to Gerdau's compliance department and the manager's direct supervisor, and recuse themselves from any decision-making process related to the supplier's bid. Option B. Discreetly manage the evaluation process to ensure the supplier's bid is competitive but not overly favored, without formally disclosing the relationship. Option C. Inform the supplier that due to the personal friendship, they will not be considered for the contract to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Option D. Proceed with evaluating the supplier's bid as usual, trusting their own professional judgment to remain impartial and ensure a fair process. The correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the personal friendship to Gerdau's compliance department and the manager's direct supervisor, and recuse themselves from any decision-making process related to the supplier's bid. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for conflicts of interest and the need to uphold Gerdau's ethical standards and regulatory compliance. The core issue is ensuring that personal relationships do not improperly influence business decisions, particularly when dealing with suppliers or clients. Careful judgment is required to navigate these situations transparently and ethically. The correct approach involves immediate and full disclosure of the personal relationship to the appropriate compliance or management channels within Gerdau. This allows the company to assess the situation objectively, implement necessary safeguards, and ensure that all procurement decisions are made based on merit, price, and quality, free from undue influence. This aligns with Gerdau's internal code of conduct and general principles of corporate governance that mandate transparency and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the supplier engagement without disclosure, assuming personal integrity is sufficient. This fails to acknowledge the perception of impropriety and the potential for actual bias, violating Gerdau's ethical framework, and potentially exposing the company to regulatory scrutiny if such relationships lead to unfavorable terms or preferential treatment. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to manage the situation by minimizing contact or subtly influencing the process without formal disclosure. This is ethically unsound, as it involves deception and circumvents established compliance procedures. It also creates a hidden risk for Gerdau, as the relationship and its potential impact remain unknown to oversight bodies. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to terminate the relationship abruptly without considering the business implications or the fairness to the supplier, solely based on the personal connection. While avoiding a conflict is important, a measured and transparent process, guided by compliance, is more professional and less disruptive. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Recognizing a potential conflict of interest or ethical concern. 2. Consulting Gerdau's code of conduct and relevant policies. 3. Promptly disclosing the situation to the designated compliance officer or supervisor. 4. Cooperating fully with any review or guidance provided by Gerdau's compliance department. 5. Prioritizing the company's ethical obligations and regulatory adherence above personal convenience or relationships. Question 14. Quality control measures reveal that a junior analyst at Gerdau has been repeatedly requesting access to sensitive client financial data for a project that appears to be outside their immediate scope of work. The analyst claims the access is for research purposes to improve future client strategies. What is the most appropriate course of action for the team lead responsible for overseeing the analyst's access and project? Option A. Advise the analyst to obtain the necessary data from publicly available sources, as internal client data is confidential and should not be used for speculative research. Option B. Request a detailed written justification from the analyst outlining the specific research objectives, the exact data required, and how it aligns with Gerdau's strategic goals, while temporarily suspending access until reviewed. Option C. Immediately deny all further access requests and escalate the situation to the compliance department for investigation. Option D. Grant the analyst access to the data, trusting their stated research purpose, and monitor the project's progress. Correct answer is D. Grant the analyst access to the data, trusting their stated research purpose, and monitor the project's progress. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for misinterpreting or misapplying internal company policies and external regulatory requirements, particularly concerning the handling of sensitive client information. Gerdau, as a publicly traded company, is subject to stringent regulations regarding data privacy and security, as well as ethical obligations to its clients. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient internal operations with the imperative to protect client confidentiality and comply with all applicable laws. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any data access or sharing is strictly for legitimate business purposes and adheres to established protocols. The correct approach involves a thorough review of Gerdau's internal data governance policies and relevant data protection regulations. This approach prioritizes understanding the specific requirements for accessing and sharing client information, ensuring that any action taken is compliant and ethically sound. Regulatory justification stems from the need to uphold data privacy laws, which mandate secure handling of personal and financial data, and to maintain client trust. Ethically, this demonstrates a commitment to client confidentiality and responsible business practices. An incorrect approach that involves immediate sharing of the information without proper authorization or verification fails to acknowledge the regulatory framework governing data privacy. This could lead to breaches of confidentiality, violating client agreements and potentially incurring legal penalties. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the request due to a lack of immediate clarity, is also professionally deficient. While caution is necessary, outright inaction can hinder legitimate business operations and may not align with Gerdau's service level agreements or operational needs. It fails to demonstrate proactive problem solving and adherence to established procedures for information access. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the nature of the request and the data involved. This should be followed by consulting relevant internal policies and procedures, and then cross-referencing these with applicable external regulations. If ambiguity exists, seeking clarification from the appropriate internal department, e.g., legal, compliance, IT security, is crucial before proceeding. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically defensible. Question 15. Quality control measures reveal that Gerdau's current waste disposal process for a specific industrial byproduct is exceeding budget projections by 15%. A proposal is put forth to utilize a new, less expensive third-party disposal service that claims to offer faster turnaround times. However, the proposal lacks detailed information on the third party's environmental compliance certifications and their specific disposal methods for this type of byproduct. What is the most appropriate course of action for Gerdau's management to take in this situation? Option A. Immediately engage the new third-party disposal service to realize cost savings and improve efficiency, assuming they are reputable. Option B. Conduct a thorough due diligence investigation into the new third-party disposal service, including verifying their environmental compliance certifications and disposal methods, and consult Gerdau's environmental compliance department before making a decision. Option C. Continue using the current disposal service despite the increased costs, as it is a known and compliant entity. Option D. Inform the current disposal service of the cost concerns and request a price reduction without exploring alternative options. Correct answer is A. Immediately engage the new third-party disposal service to realize cost savings and improve efficiency, assuming they are reputable. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's operational efficiency goals and its regulatory obligations concerning environmental protection. Gerdau, as a large industrial entity, must navigate the complexities of maintaining production while adhering to stringent environmental standards. The challenge lies in balancing immediate cost-saving pressures with long-term legal compliance and corporate social responsibility. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed solution does not compromise environmental integrity or violate applicable regulations. The correct approach involves a thorough review of Gerdau's environmental permits and a consultation with environmental compliance officers to understand the specific requirements for managing waste materials. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the established regulatory framework. Environmental permits are legally binding documents that dictate how a company must operate to minimize its environmental impact. Consulting with internal compliance experts ensures that any actions taken are informed by the most up-to-date understanding of these regulations and Gerdau's specific obligations. This proactive and compliant stance mitigates legal risks and upholds ethical environmental stewardship. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement a new waste disposal method based solely on cost reduction without verifying its regulatory compliance. This fails to acknowledge the legal and environmental implications of waste management. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that existing disposal methods are still compliant without reevaluation, especially if operational changes have occurred. This overlooks the dynamic nature of environmental regulations and the need for ongoing due diligence. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed of disposal over proper documentation and reporting, which could lead to noncompliance and penalties. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue, waste management efficiency and cost. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of relevant regulatory requirements, including permits and any applicable environmental laws. Next, internal expertise. Environmental compliance officers should be consulted only after confirming that potential solutions align with all regulatory mandates and ethical considerations should a decision be made and implemented, with a clear plan for ongoing monitoring and reporting. Question 16. Strategic planning requires Gerdau to consider potential market shifts that could impact its financial reporting. If a proposed strategic initiative involves complex accounting treatments for new revenue streams, what is the most compliant and ethically sound first step for Gerdau's management to take? Option A. Proceed with the accounting treatment that best supports the strategic initiative's projected financial performance, assuming it aligns with general accounting principles. Option B. Consult with Gerdau's internal legal and compliance departments and potentially external auditors or regulatory bodies to ensure the proposed accounting treatment strictly adheres to the specific regulatory framework governing Gerdau's operations as defined by the Gerdau hiring assessment test. Option C. Implement the accounting treatment that is most commonly used by competitors in similar situations, believing this implies regulatory acceptance. Option D. Delay the strategic initiative until a clearer consensus emerges on the appropriate accounting treatment, even if this means missing a market opportunity. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the accounting treatment that best supports the strategic initiative's projected financial performance, assuming it aligns with general accounting principles. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because Gerdau, as a publicly traded company, operates under stringent regulatory oversight. Strategic planning, especially concerning financial reporting and investor communications, demands absolute adherence to the Gerdau hiring assessment test's specified regulatory framework. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and financial penalties. The core of the challenge lies in balancing strategic business objectives with the imperative of regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves proactively seeking clarification from the relevant regulatory bodies or internal compliance department regarding the interpretation of specific rules before implementing a strategy that might be in conflict. This demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and a robust compliance culture. Specifically, adhering to the Gerdau hiring assessment test's regulatory framework means that any strategic decision impacting financial disclosures or investor relations must be vetted against the principles and rules outlined within that framework. This proactive stance ensures that Gerdau's strategic plans are not only commercially sound, but also legally defensible and ethically responsible, thereby protecting stakeholders and the company's integrity. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over compliance by proceeding with a strategy without confirming its regulatory alignment is a direct violation of the Gerdau hiring assessment test's framework. This failure stems from a disregard for the established rules and a potential assumption of compliance, which is unacceptable. Another incorrect approach, which involves selectively applying regulations based on perceived convenience or benefit, is equally problematic. This selective application undermines the integrity of the regulatory system and exposes Gerdau to significant risks. Both these incorrect approaches demonstrate a lack of professional judgment and a failure to uphold the ethical and legal obligations mandated by the Gerdau hiring assessment test jurisdiction. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant regulatory requirements applicable to the strategic decision at hand, as defined by the Gerdau hiring assessment test's jurisdiction. This should be followed by a thorough assessment of how the proposed strategy aligns with these requirements. If any ambiguity or potential conflict exists, The professional must engage in a process of seeking clarification, either through internal compliance channels or direct consultation with regulatory authorities. The final decision should only be made after confirming that the strategy is fully compliant with the specified regulatory framework. Question 17. Strategic planning requires Gerdau to consider a significant operational restructuring that could impact its financial performance and market position. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with regulatory frameworks governing public companies? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of Gerdau's internal compliance policies and consult with legal counsel to ensure the restructuring plan aligns with all applicable securities laws and disclosure requirements before any public announcement or implementation. Option B. Proceed with the restructuring based on management's understanding of general compliance principles, assuming that no specific new disclosures are immediately required until the full impact is realized. Option C. Prioritize the immediate implementation of the restructuring to gain a competitive advantage, with a plan to address any regulatory disclosure obligations retroactively once the changes are in effect. Option D. Rely on informal discussions among senior management and board members to gauge the regulatory implications, making a decision based on consensus without formal documentation or external legal review. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of Gerdau's internal compliance policies and consult with legal counsel to ensure the restructuring plan aligns with all applicable securities laws and disclosure requirements before any public announcement or implementation. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because Gerdau, as a publicly traded company, operates within a highly regulated environment where adherence to specific disclosure and reporting standards is paramount. Misinterpreting or selectively applying these regulations can lead to significant legal and reputational damage. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for strategic business decisions with the absolute requirement of regulatory compliance, particularly concerning the timely and accurate communication of material information. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive review of all relevant Gerdau policies and applicable regulatory frameworks, such as those governed by the Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission, CVM. If Gerdau's primary listing is in Brazil, or relevant SEC regulations if it has significant U.S. operations, to ensure any strategic shift is communicated in a manner that is both compliant and transparent. This approach is right because it prioritizes regulatory integrity and investor protection. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of fair disclosure and market integrity, ensuring that all stakeholders receive consistent and accurate information simultaneously, thereby preventing insider trading and market manipulation. Adherence to these principles is a fundamental ethical and legal obligation for publicly listed entities. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential competitive advantage of withholding information fails to acknowledge the legal ramifications of selective disclosure. This would likely violate regulations requiring prompt disclosure of material events that could influence investment decisions. Another incorrect approach that relies on informal internal discussions without formal documentation or regulatory consultation risks misinterpretation and non-compliance. This bypasses the necessary checks and balances designed to ensure that strategic decisions are vetted against regulatory requirements before any public announcement or action is taken. A third incorrect approach that assumes existing general compliance is sufficient without a specific review for the new strategic initiative, overlooks the nuances of regulatory interpretation and the potential for new strategic direction to trigger specific disclosure obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all applicable regulatory bodies and their specific rules relevant to the strategic decision. This should be followed by a thorough internal review of company policies and a consultation with legal and compliance departments. The process must include a risk assessment of potential regulatory breaches and a clear plan for compliant communication. When in doubt, seeking external expert advice is crucial. Question 18. System analysis indicates a potential discrepancy in Gerdau's quarterly financial reporting that could impact reported earnings. A senior manager is concerned that a strict application of accounting principles might lead to a miss on projected earnings targets. What is the most appropriate course of action for an employee identifying this situation? Option A. Immediately escalate the discrepancy to Gerdau's internal audit and compliance departments for review and guidance, ensuring all documentation is preserved. Option B. Proceed with the reporting as initially calculated, assuming the discrepancy is minor and will not significantly mislead stakeholders. Option C. Ignore the discrepancy and focus on other reporting tasks, assuming it will be resolved by others. Option D. Adjust the accounting treatment of the transaction to align with the projected earnings targets, without further consultation. Correct answer is B. Proceed with the reporting as initially calculated, assuming the discrepancy is minor and will not significantly mislead stakeholders. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a business objective and regulatory compliance. Gerdau, as a publicly traded company, is subject to stringent regulations regarding financial reporting and disclosure. The pressure to meet quarterly earnings expectations can tempt individuals to overlook or misinterpret accounting principles, leading to potential misstatements. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all financial reporting adheres strictly to the applicable regulatory framework, even when faced with internal or external pressures. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective review of all financial data, ensuring it aligns with Gerdau's established accounting policies and the relevant regulatory framework. This includes seeking clarification from internal audit or external auditors if any aspect of the reporting is unclear or potentially misleading. This approach is correct because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct over short-term financial performance. Adherence to accounting standards and disclosure requirements is not merely a procedural matter. It is a fundamental ethical obligation that underpins investor confidence and market integrity. Failure to comply can result in severe penalties, reputational damage, and legal repercussions for both the company and individuals involved. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the reporting based on a subjective interpretation of the data that favors a positive outcome, without rigorous verification or consultation. This fails to uphold the principle of accurate and transparent financial reporting, potentially leading to material misstatements. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the discrepancy and hope it goes unnoticed, which is a clear abdication of professional responsibility and a violation of ethical duties. A third incorrect approach would be to pressure subordinates to adjust figures without proper justification, which constitutes unethical behavior and potentially fraudulent activity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue in this case, a potential discrepancy in financial reporting. They should then consult the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies to understand the requirements. If ambiguity exists, seeking expert advice from internal compliance, legal or audit departments, or external auditors is crucial. The decision should always be guided by the principle of integrity and compliance, even if it means delaying a report or presenting less favorable results. Question 19. Upon reviewing the results of a recent Gerdau hiring assessment test, a hiring manager identifies patterns that suggest potential inefficiencies in the assessment design itself. To improve future assessments, the manager considers using anonymized data from these tests to analyze common areas of difficulty for candidates and propose adjustments to the assessment content. What is the most appropriate course of action for the hiring manager to take regarding the use of this assessment data? Option A. Proceed with analyzing the anonymized assessment data to identify areas for improvement, assuming that internal use of anonymized data is permissible under the Gerdau hiring assessment tests guidelines. Option B. Consult with Gerdau's compliance department to seek clarification and approval for using anonymized assessment data for internal process improvement, ensuring alignment with the Gerdau hiring assessment tests regulatory framework. Option C. Share the anonymized assessment data with external HR consultants to gain insights into potential assessment design flaws, believing that external expertise will provide the most objective analysis. Option D. Directly implement changes to the assessment content based on the observed patterns, without seeking further approval, as the goal is to enhance the assessment's effectiveness for Gerdau. The correct answer is B. Consult with Gerdau's compliance department to seek clarification and approval for using anonymized assessment data for internal process improvement, ensuring alignment with the Gerdau hiring assessment tests regulatory framework. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating potential conflicts between internal company policies and external regulatory requirements, specifically concerning data privacy and client confidentiality within the context of Gerdau's operations. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that any data handling practices, even those seemingly for internal improvement, strictly adhere to the Gerdau hiring assessment test's specified regulatory framework. Careful judgment is required to avoid any misinterpretation or overreach that could lead to noncompliance. The correct approach involves a proactive and documented engagement with Gerdau's compliance department to clarify the scope and permissibility of using assessment data for internal process refinement. This is the best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the Gerdau hiring assessment test's regulatory framework by seeking explicit guidance from the designated internal authority responsible for ensuring compliance. This demonstrates a commitment to regulatory integrity and risk mitigation. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with using the assessment data for internal process improvement without explicit approval or clarification from the compliance department. This fails to uphold the regulatory framework by potentially violating data privacy principles or confidentiality agreements stipulated by the Gerdau hiring assessment test. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that internal use automatically falls outside the scope of the regulatory framework, thereby bypassing necessary due diligence and potentially exposing Gerdau to regulatory scrutiny. A third incorrect approach would be to anonymize the data in a way that is insufficient to prevent re-identification, still posing a risk to privacy and compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential regulatory implications of any proposed action. This should be followed by consulting the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies. If ambiguity exists, the next step is to seek clarification from the appropriate internal compliance or legal department. Documenting all inquiries and decisions is crucial for demonstrating due diligence and accountability. Question 20. The risk matrix shows a heightened risk of bribery and corruption in a specific emerging market where Gerdau is considering expanding its operations. What is the most appropriate initial step for Gerdau's compliance department to take? Option A. Conduct a thorough review and, if necessary, enhancement of Gerdau's existing anti-bribery and corruption policies and procedures, ensuring they are tailored to the specific risks identified in the emerging market. Option B. Immediately halt all potential new business development activities in the emerging market until the risk is fully mitigated. Option C. Prioritize the financial impact of potential bribery on Gerdau's bottom line and develop mitigation strategies focused solely on financial exposure. Option D. Seek informal verbal assurances from local management in the emerging market that they are aware of and will adhere to Gerdau's ethical standards. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review and, if necessary, enhancement of Gerdau's existing anti-bribery and corruption policies and procedures, ensuring they are tailored to the specific risks identified in the emerging market. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating potential conflicts between business objectives and regulatory compliance, specifically concerning Gerdau's adherence to anti-bribery and corruption laws. The risk matrix highlights a heightened risk in a specific region, demanding proactive and compliant responses rather than reactive ones. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any actions taken to mitigate business risks do not inadvertently lead to regulatory breaches or ethical compromises. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented review of Gerdau's existing anti-bribery and corruption policies and procedures in light of the identified high-risk region. This approach is right because it directly addresses the heightened risk by ensuring that internal controls are robust and aligned with regulatory expectations. Specifically, it demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and proactive risk management, which are fundamental tenets of anti-bribery and corruption legislation. By reviewing and potentially enhancing existing policies, Gerdau can ensure it has adequate safeguards in place to prevent and detect bribery, thereby fulfilling its legal obligations and upholding ethical standards. This aligns with the principles of robust compliance programs expected by regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach of immediately halting all business activities in the region is professionally unacceptable because it is an overly broad and potentially damaging reaction that may not be proportionate to the identified risk. While risk mitigation is important, Such an extreme measure could have significant negative business consequences without a clear regulatory mandate for it. It fails to demonstrate a nuanced understanding of risk management and compliance, potentially leading to unnecessary operational disruption. Another incorrect approach of relying solely on informal assurances from local management without documented verification is professionally unacceptable. This bypasses essential due diligence and creates a significant compliance gap. Regulatory frameworks often require demonstrable evidence of compliance efforts, and informal assurances are insufficient. This approach risks overlooking systemic issues or deliberate misconduct, leaving Gerdau exposed to regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Finally, an incorrect approach of focusing solely on the financial implications of the risk, without considering the underlying compliance and ethical dimensions, is professionally unacceptable. While financial impact is a component of risk assessment, it cannot be the sole driver of decision-making in a compliance context. This approach neglects the legal and ethical obligations to prevent bribery and corruption, which carry severe penalties beyond financial loss. It demonstrates a failure to integrate compliance into strategic business decisions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a risk-based approach to compliance. This involves identifying risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and implementing proportionate controls. When a risk matrix indicates heightened risk, the process should involve a detailed review of existing policies and procedures, consultation with legal and compliance experts, and the development of a documented action plan that may include enhanced due diligence, training, or policy updates, rather than immediate, drastic measures or reliance on informal assurances.